In the marble halls of Renaissance Florence, where power shifted like sand through an hourglass and fortunes rose and fell with the changing tides of political favor, Niccolò Machiavelli understood a truth that would echo through centuries: the greatest vulnerability of any leader, any person of ambition, was not external opposition but internal weakness. The man who could master his own emotional landscape held a weapon more devastating than any army, more precise than any blade. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio as Machiavelli observed the young Lorenzo de' Medici pace nervously before an important negotiation. The heir to one of Florence's most powerful banking dynasties possessed wealth, connections, and political backing that most men could only dream of. Yet here he stood, his hands trembling slightly, his breath shallow, his mind clouded by anxiety about the outcome of a single meeting. In that moment, Machiavelli saw illustrated the fundamental paradox of human nature, that those who possessed the most material power were often the most emotionally enslaved. "Your Excellence," Machiavelli said quietly, his voice cutting through Lorenzo's anxious muttering, "what is it that you truly fear in this negotiation?" Lorenzo stopped his pacing, turning to face the older man with surprise. "Fear? I fear nothing. This is merely preparation." Machiavelli's weathered face remained impassive. "Forgive my observation, but I have witnessed many men prepare for battle, for diplomatic encounters, for matters of life and death. This is not preparation. This is attachment to a specific outcome that has transformed you from a prince into a prisoner." The words hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Lorenzo's immediate impulse was to defend himself, to assert his composure and authority. But something in Machiavelli's steady gaze prevented the reflexive response. Instead, he found himself considering the observation with uncomfortable recognition. "I have studied the rise and fall of principalities for decades," Machiavelli continued, settling into a chair as if beginning a casual conversation rather than delivering a lesson that would reshape Lorenzo's understanding of power itself. "I have watched brilliant men destroy themselves not through external conquest but through internal bondage. They become so invested in particular outcomes, so emotionally dependent on specific results, that they lose the very flexibility and clarity that brought them to power in the first place." Machiavelli gestured toward the window, where the bustling streets of Florence stretched out below them. "Consider the merchant in the marketplace. If he becomes emotionally attached to selling every bolt of silk at the exact price he envisions, if he cannot adapt to the fluctuations of demand and supply, if he takes each failed negotiation as a personal affront rather than mere information, he will soon find himself bankrupt. The successful merchant maintains what I call profitable detachment. He cares deeply about his success but remains emotionally unbound from any single transaction." Lorenzo found himself drawn into the metaphor despite his initial resistance. "But surely there must be some things worth fighting for, worth being attached to? Some principles, some outcomes that matter enough to risk everything?" A slight smile played at the corners of Machiavelli's mouth. "An excellent question, one that reveals the sophistication of your thinking. Yes, there are principles worth upholding, goals worth pursuing with every fiber of your being. But here lies the crucial distinction that separates the master from the slave, the prince from the commoner: commitment without attachment." The phrase hung between them like a riddle waiting to be solved. Machiavelli rose from his chair and moved to a large map of Italy that dominated one wall of the chamber. His finger traced the borders between city-states, kingdoms, and republics, boundaries that had shifted countless times throughout history. "Look at these borders, Lorenzo. Each line represents thousands of deaths, fortunes spent, families destroyed. Yet what are they really? Merely the current state of affairs, subject to change with the next war, the next marriage alliance, the next economic upheaval." The rulers who understood this, who could fight fiercely for their territory while remaining internally prepared for any outcome, these were the ones who survived and thrived across generations. Machiavelli's finger stopped at a small territory that had changed hands 7 times in the past century. "The Duke of Ferrara once told me something that stayed with me forever. He said, 'Niccolò, I will defend this land with my life, I will spend my treasure and risk my reputation to hold it. But I sleep peacefully every night because I know that my true power lies not in any piece of ground, but in my ability to adapt, to rebuild, to find new opportunities regardless of what tomorrow brings.'" Lorenzo felt something shift in his understanding, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. So you're suggesting that true strength comes from caring and not caring simultaneously? Precisely. The weak man is enslaved by his emotions. He cannot act effectively because he is paralyzed by fear of loss, blinded by hope for specific gains, or clouded by anger at obstacles. The strong man has destroyed this weak self through discipline and understanding. He acts with full commitment while remaining internally free from the tyranny of outcome dependency. Machiavelli returned to his chair, his movements deliberate and economical. Let me tell you about Caesar, since you admire him so. Do you think Caesar conquered Gaul because he was attached to conquering Gaul? Do you think he crossed the Rubicon because he was emotionally invested in becoming dictator of Rome? I suppose I always assumed he was driven by ambition, by desire for power and glory. Ah, but you mistake the nature of true ambition. Caesar was indeed ambitious, but his ambition was not emotional bondage, it was strategic clarity. He saw opportunities, he assessed risks, he made decisions based on rational calculation rather than emotional investment. When he said the die is cast as he crossed the Rubicon, he was not expressing passionate attachment to a particular outcome. He was acknowledging that he had made a calculated decision and would now adapt to whatever consequences emerged. Machiavelli leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on an intensity that commanded attention. The weak Caesar, the one that history might have produced, would have crossed the Rubicon in a state of desperate attachment to becoming dictator. He would have been so emotionally invested in that specific outcome that he would have made poor decisions along the way, been unable to adapt when circumstances changed, and likely would have been destroyed by his own rigidity. Lorenzo found himself completely absorbed in this reframing of historical events he thought he understood. But how does one develop this detachment? It seems to go against human nature itself. An excellent observation. It does go against untrained human nature. That is precisely why it is a source of power, because so few achieve it, those who do gain an enormous advantage. Machiavelli stood and began to pace slowly, his movements measured and thoughtful. The development of detachment begins with a brutal honesty about the nature of attachment itself. Most men believe their attachments are noble, justified, even necessary. They say I must have this promotion because I deserve it, or this relationship must work because I have invested so much in it, or this business venture must succeed because I need the money. But, observe closely, these statements all contain the seeds of weakness. Lorenzo nodded slowly, recognizing patterns in his own thinking that he had never questioned before. The attached man makes decisions based on what he wants to be true rather than what is true. He cannot see clearly because his vision is clouded by his emotional investment. He cannot act flexibly because he is bound to specific strategies and outcomes. He cannot learn from failure because failure becomes a personal attack on his identity rather than valuable information about reality. Machiavelli paused by the window again, watching the eternal dance of commerce and politics playing out in the streets below. But the detached man, he possesses a terrible freedom. He can see situations as they truly are, unclouded by wishful thinking. He can change strategies without ego involvement because he is not identified with any particular approach. He can learn from every outcome, whether success or failure, because his sense of self is not dependent on external results. This sounds almost cold, Lorenzo observed, though his tone suggested fascination rather than criticism. Machiavelli turned back to him with a look that was both stern and compassionate. Only to those who have never experienced true warmth. The detached man is not cold, he is free to be fully warm when warmth serves his purposes, fully fierce when fierceness is called for, fully gentle when gentleness is the tool required. The attached man, by contrast, is a slave to his emotional patterns. He cannot be truly warm because his warmth is desperate, cannot be effectively fierce because his anger is reactive, cannot be genuinely gentle because his gentleness is weak. The concept was beginning to crystallize in Lorenzo's mind, though he could sense it would take time to fully understand its implications. So this is what you mean by destroying the weak self? Exactly. The weak self is the collection of emotional patterns, attachments, and dependencies that limit your effectiveness and make you vulnerable to manipulation by others. When you are attached to specific outcomes, others can control you by threatening those outcomes. When you are identified with particular roles or achievements, others can destabilize you by attacking those identities. When you need external validation, others possess the power to grant or withhold your peace of mind. Machiavelli's voice grew more intense as he continued. But, the man who has destroyed his weak self through the cultivation of detachment, this man becomes truly formidable. He cannot be controlled through his fears because he is not attached to what might be lost. He cannot be manipulated through his desires because he is not enslaved by what he wants to gain. He cannot be destabilized through attacks on his identity because his sense of self is not dependent on external roles or achievements. Lorenzo felt a chill of recognition as he realized how many of his own vulnerabilities fit exactly the patterns Machiavelli was describing. His anxiety about the upcoming negotiation, his need for his father's approval, his fear of making mistakes that might damage his reputation, all of these were forms of attachment that others could exploit. "I'm beginning to understand," Lorenzo said slowly, "but I still struggle with the practical application. How does one actually go about destroying these attachments? They feel so natural, so much a part of who I am." Machiavelli smiled, recognizing the question as a sign that his student was beginning to grasp the true depth of the challenge. "Ah, now you ask the question that separates the philosopher from the practitioner. Understanding the concept intellectually is merely the first step. The actual cultivation of detachment requires methods as precise and demanding as the training of a master swordsman." He moved to a desk and withdrew a small, leather-bound journal filled with his careful handwriting. "I have spent years developing and refining techniques for this inner work. Let me share with you the first fundamental practice, the discipline of outcome independence." Lorenzo leaned forward, sensing that he was about to receive instruction of immense practical value. "Tomorrow morning, before you eat, before you attend to any business, you will spend 1 hour in systematic mental rehearsal. You will imagine your upcoming negotiation proceeding in 3 different ways, exactly as you hope it will go, in a way that is completely contrary to your wishes, and in a way that is entirely unexpected. For each scenario, you will practice maintaining the same inner calm, the same clarity of thought, the same strategic flexibility." Machiavelli's instructions had the precision of a military drill. This is not passive visualization. You will actively cultivate the feeling of being equally prepared for any outcome. You will train your nervous system to remain steady regardless of external circumstances. You will teach your mind to see each possible result not as success or failure, but simply as information that will inform your next decision. Lorenzo found himself both excited and intimidated by the specificity of the practice. And this actually works? This kind of mental training can genuinely reduce attachment? It works because it addresses attachment at its source. Attachment is not merely an intellectual position, it is a physical and emotional conditioning. Your body has learned to tense when certain outcomes are threatened. Your emotions have learned to spike when particular possibilities arise. Your mind has learned to narrow its focus when specific desires are involved. This training systematically reconditions all 3 levels. Machiavelli closed the journal and fixed Lorenzo with a steady gaze. "But, understand this clearly, this is not a gentle, comfortable process. You will be deliberately exposing yourself to the very situations that trigger your attachments. You will be training yourself to remain calm in circumstances that have previously caused you anxiety. This requires courage, not the courage of the battlefield, but the courage to face your own internal weaknesses without flinching." The room fell silent as Lorenzo contemplated the magnitude of what was being proposed. It was one thing to intellectually understand the value of detachment, quite another to commit to the disciplined practice required to achieve it. "There is something else you must understand," Machiavelli continued, his tone becoming even more serious. "This path is not for everyone. Most men prefer their comfortable slavery to the demanding freedom of mastery. They would rather remain predictable in their weaknesses than face the uncertainty of genuine strength. If you choose this path, you will find that you become increasingly incomprehensible to ordinary men." Lorenzo felt the weight of the choice before him. "What do you mean by that?" "Men who are enslaved by their attachments cannot understand those who are free from them. They will interpret your calm as coldness, your flexibility as inconsistency, your strategic thinking as manipulation. they will project onto you their own emotional patterns and motivations, unable to conceive of a different way of being. Machiavelli moved to a shelf lined with treatises on statecraft, his fingers tracing the spines of works that had shaped political thought for generations. This is why true power is so often lonely. Not because the powerful man cannot connect with others, but because so few others have developed the inner strength to relate to genuine power without being overwhelmed or resentful. You make it sound like a form of exile, Lorenzo observed. It is, in a sense. You will be exiled from the common delusions that provide comfort to ordinary men. You will no longer be able to lose yourself in fantasies about how things should be, because you will see too clearly how things actually are. You will no longer be able to blame your difficulties on external circumstances, because you will understand your own role in creating every situation you encounter. Machiavelli's voice softened slightly. But this exile is also a liberation. You will be free to engage with reality directly, without the distortions created by emotional attachment. You will be able to love more fully because your love will not be desperate or possessive. You will be able to work more effectively because your efforts will not be contaminated by anxiety about results. You will be able to lead more powerfully because your leadership will be based on clarity and strength rather than neediness and manipulation. Lorenzo stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that would someday be his responsibility to govern. The people moving through the streets below seemed suddenly fragile and driven by forces they didn't understand. How long does this transformation typically take? For a man of intelligence and discipline, the basic principles can be grasped in months. The deeper conditioning takes years. True mastery, that is the work of a lifetime. Machiavelli joined him at the window. But even the beginning stages produce dramatic results. You will notice changes in your effectiveness, your peace of mind, and your relationships within weeks of serious practice. And the risks? Surely there must be risks in this kind of inner work. Machiavelli nodded approvingly at the question. Indeed. The primary risk is that you may become so detached from outcome that you cease to act effectively in the world. This is the difference between healthy detachment and mere indifference. The master remains deeply committed to excellence, to justice, to the welfare of those under his protection. His detachment is from specific outcomes, not from engagement with life itself. Lorenzo turned to study his mentor's face. How do you maintain that balance? How do you care deeply while remaining unattached? Through understanding the difference between love and need. When you love something, whether it is a person, a cause, or a goal, you want what is best for it, even if that requires sacrifice on your part. When you need something, you want it to serve your emotional requirements, regardless of what might be best for it. Love is expansive and generous. Need is contractive and selfish. The distinction struck Lorenzo with the force of revelation. So detachment actually enables deeper love? Precisely. When you are not attached to someone behaving in a particular way, you can love them as they actually are. When you are not attached to a specific political outcome, you can work for justice without being corrupted by the need for personal vindication. When you are not attached to immediate success, you can pursue long-term goals with patience and wisdom. Machiavelli moved away from the window and began gathering his papers. This concludes our first session on this topic. But, before you leave, I want to give you one additional practice that will accelerate your development. Lorenzo straightened, ready to receive further instruction. Every evening, before you sleep, you will review the day and identify every moment when you acted from attachment rather than from detachment. You will note when you were anxious about outcomes, when you were emotionally reactive to circumstances, when you made decisions based on need rather than on strategic wisdom. You will do this without self-judgment, simply as an observer collecting data. Machiavelli's instructions continued with characteristic precision. Then, you will mentally replay those same situations, imagining how you might have responded differently from a state of detachment. This is not about regret or self-criticism. It is about training your mind to recognize the difference between attached and detached responses, so that you can make different choices in future situations. Lorenzo felt both excitement and apprehension about beginning this inner work. The prospect of greater personal power was compelling, but the discipline required seemed formidable. Remember, Machiavelli said as they prepared to part, the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has eliminated the very vulnerabilities through which destruction becomes possible. Others can take your possessions, your position, even your life. But they cannot take your peace of mind, your clarity of perception, or your freedom to choose your responses. These become yours permanently once you have done the inner work to claim them. As Lorenzo left the Palazzo Vecchio that day, his mind churned with new possibilities. The negotiation that had seemed so critical that morning now appeared as merely one event among many, an opportunity to practice the principles he was beginning to understand. For the first time in months, he felt a strange sense of lightness, as if invisible chains he hadn't known he was carrying had suddenly loosened. The transformation Machiavelli described might take years to complete, but Lorenzo could sense that it had already begun. Part 2, The Alchemy of Inner Strength. 3 months had passed since that initial conversation in the Palazzo Vecchio, and Lorenzo de' Medici found himself facing the greatest crisis of his young life. The Pazzi conspiracy had been discovered, several family allies had been assassinated, and rival banking houses were circling like vultures, seeking to exploit the Medici family's moment of vulnerability. Under normal circumstances, such a combination of threats would have reduced Lorenzo to a state of panicked desperation. Instead, he stood in his private study, reviewing intelligence reports with a calm that surprised even himself. Machiavelli entered the room to find his student displaying exactly the kind of composed clarity they had been working to cultivate. The older man observed Lorenzo for a moment before speaking, noting the steady posture, the focused attention, the absence of the nervous energy that had previously characterized the young man's response to pressure. "Your transformation has been remarkable," Machiavelli said as he settled into his usual chair. 3 months ago, this situation would have destroyed your ability to think strategically. Today, you are processing information and making decisions as if this were merely another day of routine business. Lorenzo looked up from the papers spread before him, his expression thoughtful rather than stressed. "The daily practices you taught me have become so ingrained that they operate almost automatically now. When I received word of the assassination attempts, my first impulse was the old pattern of anxiety and reactive planning. But, within minutes, the training took over. I found myself naturally moving into that state of calm observation you call strategic detachment." Machiavelli smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had successfully internalized a crucial lesson. "Excellent. This confirms that you are ready for the next level of instruction. The basic practices have given you emotional stability and clarity of perception. Now we must develop what I call the alchemy of inner strength, the ability to transform every experience, whether pleasant or painful, into increased personal power." Lorenzo pushed the intelligence reports aside, recognizing that he was about to receive instruction of even greater significance than their previous work. "I'm ready. These past months have shown me the practical value of everything you've taught. I want to understand how to go deeper. The alchemical principle is simple in concept but profound in application," Machiavelli began, his tone taking on the formal quality of a master craftsman explaining advanced techniques. "Most men are weakened by difficulty and made soft by pleasure. The man who understands inner alchemy is strengthened by difficulty and made wiser by pleasure. He has learned to extract power from every experience, regardless of its surface characteristics." Machiavelli rose and moved to a collection of ancient texts that lined one wall of Lorenzo's study. His finger traced the spine of a work on Stoic philosophy before selecting a slim volume bound in worn leather. The ancient philosophers understood this principle, though they expressed it in different terms. Marcus Aurelius wrote that every obstacle is an opportunity for growth. But they did not provide the practical methods for actualizing this understanding in the chaos of real-world politics and leadership. Lorenzo leaned forward, intrigued by the suggestion that there were specific techniques for transforming adversity into strength. "What methods have you developed? How does one actually perform this kind of alchemy?" "The process involves 3 distinct stages, each building upon the previous one. The first stage is what I call reframing for power. Instead of asking, 'Why is this happening to me?' which is the question of a victim, you learn to ask, 'How can I use this situation to become stronger, wiser, or more capable?'" Machiavelli opened the ancient text and, pointed to a passage written in elegant Latin script. Look at your current crisis through this lens. The Puzzy conspiracy has revealed weaknesses in your family's security apparatus, shown you which allies are truly loyal and which are merely opportunistic, and forced you to develop crisis management skills that you would never have acquired during peaceful times. Each of these insights makes you more formidable as a leader. Lorenzo felt a shift in his perspective as he considered the conspiracy from this angle. You're suggesting that I should actually be grateful for this attack? Not grateful in an emotional sense. That would be a form of spiritual bypassing that ignores the real harm that has been done. But strategically appreciative of the opportunities it has created for your development. The weak man sees only the immediate pain and danger. The strong man sees the pain and danger clearly, but also perceives the hidden gifts embedded within challenging circumstances. Machiavelli closed the book and fixed Lorenzo with an intense stare. This reframing is not mere positive thinking or philosophical consolation. It is a fundamental shift in how you relate to reality itself. When you consistently look for the power-building potential in every situation, you begin to see patterns that are invisible to ordinary perception. Lorenzo nodded slowly, beginning to grasp the practical implications. And the second stage? The second stage is experiential extraction, the systematic process of mining every experience for maximum learning and strength building. This requires a discipline that most men never develop because it is easier to simply react to events than to consciously extract wisdom from them. Machiavelli moved to Lorenzo's desk and picked up one of the intelligence reports. Consider this document. The ordinary response is to read it for information about external threats. The alchemical response is to also use it as a mirror for understanding your own patterns of thought and reaction. What assumptions are you making as you read it? What emotional responses arise, and what do they reveal about remaining attachments? What aspects of the situation trigger your natural wisdom, and what aspects expose areas where you still need to develop greater mastery? The concept was more complex than Lorenzo had initially anticipated. So you're saying that every experience contains multiple layers of potential learning? Exactly. Most men extract perhaps 5 to 10% of the available wisdom from their experiences because they focus only on the surface level of events. The man who practices experiential extraction may capture 70 to 80% of the available learning, making him many times more effective at converting experience into capability. Machiavelli sat down and pulled out his ever-present notebook, opening it to a page covered with detailed observations and analysis. Let me give you a concrete example. Last month, you had that difficult negotiation with the Venetian trade delegation. What did you learn from it? Lorenzo thought back to the meeting, which had ended with a compromise that neither party found entirely satisfactory. I learned that the Venetians are more concerned about access to our northern trade routes than about the specific terms of individual contracts. I learned that their negotiator has authority to make immediate decisions on matters under 50,000 florins but must consult with his superiors on larger issues. Good. You extracted useful tactical information. But what about the deeper levels of learning? What did you discover about your own negotiating patterns? What emotional reactions arose during the most challenging moments, and what did they teach you about areas where you still need to strengthen your detachment? How did your body language and vocal patterns change as the pressure increased, and what do those changes suggest about optimizing your future performance? Lorenzo felt slightly overwhelmed by the number of additional learning opportunities he had missed. I focused entirely on the external aspects of the negotiation. I completely ignored what it might be teaching me about myself. This is normal. Most men never think to use their daily experiences as a gymnasium for inner development. But, once you begin practicing experiential extraction systematically, you will find that your rate of personal growth accelerates dramatically. Every conversation becomes an opportunity to practice communication mastery. Every conflict becomes a chance to strengthen your emotional equilibrium. Every success becomes data about what strategies are most effective for your particular style and circumstances. Machiavelli turned to a fresh page in his notebook and began sketching a simple diagram. The third stage is integration and synthesis, the process of combining insights from multiple experiences to develop increasingly sophisticated understanding and capability. The diagram showed interconnected circles representing different types of experiences, with lines connecting them to demonstrate how learning from one area could enhance understanding in another. The ordinary man treats each experience as an isolated event. The master sees patterns across experiences and uses those patterns to predict and influence future outcomes. Lorenzo studied the diagram, beginning to see how the approach might work in practice. Can you give me an example of this kind of synthesis? Certainly. Over the past year, you have dealt with 3 different types of crisis: the grain shortage that affected the city's food supply, the border dispute with Siena, and, now, the Pazzi conspiracy. On the surface, these appear to be completely unrelated challenges. But, when examined for patterns, they reveal consistent themes about how you respond to pressure, what resources you naturally draw upon, and which aspects of leadership you find most difficult. Machiavelli's analysis continued with characteristic precision. In all 3 cases, your initial response was to seek additional information, which is wise. In all 3 cases, you tended to over-communicate with your advisors during the early stages, which sometimes created confusion about decision-making authority. And, in all 3 cases, you found your confidence and effectiveness increasing as you moved from reactive responses to proactive strategy development. Lorenzo was amazed at how clear the patterns became when viewed through this analytical lens. These insights could help me respond more effectively to future crises. Precisely. But, the synthesis goes even deeper than crisis management. These same patterns probably appear in your personal relationships, your approach to business decisions, and your methods for learning new skills. Once you identify your fundamental patterns, you can begin to consciously refine them across all areas of your life. The scope of what Machiavelli was suggesting began to dawn on Lorenzo. This wasn't simply about becoming a better leader or more effective negotiator. It was about developing a systematic approach to extracting maximum wisdom and power from every aspect of existence. This level of self-awareness seems almost supernatural, Lorenzo observed. Machiavelli laughed, a sound that was both warm and slightly sardonic. It seems supernatural only because so few men develop it. In reality, it is simply the application of systematic intelligence to the one area where most men remain completely unconscious: their own patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior. The older man rose and moved to the window, where the afternoon light was beginning to fade into evening. This brings us to a crucial point about the nature of inner alchemy. The process I am describing requires you to become an observer of your own experience while simultaneously remaining fully engaged with that experience. This is perhaps the most challenging skill to develop, because it goes against the natural tendency to be either completely absorbed in events or completely detached from them. Lorenzo struggled to understand the practical application of this concept. How does one maintain observation and engagement simultaneously? Through practice, like any other skill. You begin by setting aside specific times for reflection and analysis. The evening review practice I taught you earlier is one example. Gradually, you develop the ability to maintain a part of your awareness in observation mode even while you are actively participating in events. Machiavelli demonstrated by describing his own mental state as they talked. Right now, for instance, I am fully engaged in explaining these concepts to you and monitoring your responses to determine the most effective way to convey the information. Simultaneously, I am observing my own teaching patterns, noting which explanations seem to resonate most strongly with your learning style, and gathering data that will help me refine my instruction methods for future students. The demonstration was impressive, but Lorenzo wondered about the practical challenges of developing such awareness. Doesn't this kind of constant self-observation become exhausting? It seems like it would interfere with natural spontaneity and flow. An excellent question, and one that reveals sophisticated understanding of the potential pitfalls. Initially, yes, the practice can feel effortful and artificial. But, with time, this split attention becomes as natural as walking while simultaneously watching for obstacles. You don't lose spontaneity, you gain the ability to be spontaneous from a place of conscious choice rather than unconscious reaction. Machiavelli returned to his seat and opened his notebook to a section filled with detailed case studies. Let me show you how this works in practice by examining the inner alchemy of one of history's most successful practitioners, Julius Caesar. Lorenzo settled back in his chair, always eager to learn from historical examples. Caesar faced numerous situations that would have destroyed a lesser man: capture by pirates early in his career, crushing financial debt, political exile, military setbacks in Gaul, and, ultimately, the choice between civil war and political irrelevance. In each case, he demonstrated the three stages of inner alchemy we have been discussing. Machiavelli's analysis of Caesar was methodical and revealing. When captured by pirates, instead of viewing himself as a victim, Caesar immediately reframed the situation as an opportunity to study his enemies, develop his personal presence under pressure, and create valuable intelligence networks. He told his captors that their ransom demand was too low, thereby establishing psychological dominance even while in chains. Lorenzo found himself captivated by this reinterpretation of a familiar story. I had always heard that as an example of Caesar's arrogance. The surface interpretation focuses on arrogance, but the deeper reading reveals strategic brilliance. By claiming the pirates had undervalued him, Caesar accomplished several objectives simultaneously. He demonstrated that he was not intimidated by his circumstances, he established himself as a person of exceptional importance, and he created confusion among his captors about how to relate to him. This confusion gave him psychological leverage that he exploited throughout his captivity. Machiavelli continued with his analysis of Caesar's experiential extraction. During his time as a captive, Caesar systematically studied pirate organization, leadership dynamics, navigation methods, and combat techniques. When he later returned with ships to capture them, his success was due not to superior force but to superior intelligence gathered during his captivity. The example illustrated perfectly how apparent misfortune could be transformed into strategic advantage through proper mental approach. Lorenzo began to see his own current crisis in a new light. And the integration and synthesis? Lorenzo prompted. Caesar used insights from his pirate captivity to inform his later military and political strategies. The psychological techniques he developed for managing dangerous enemies became part of his standard approach to political opposition. The organizational insights he gained helped him structure his own military forces more effectively. The personal courage he cultivated under extreme pressure served him throughout the Gallic campaigns. Machiavelli closed his notebook and looked directly at Lorenzo. But here is the most important point: Caesar's inner alchemy was not a lucky accident or natural talent. It was a systematic approach that he consciously developed and refined throughout his life. The same approach is available to any man with the intelligence and discipline to master it. Lorenzo felt a surge of excitement about the possibilities, but also a realistic appreciation for the challenges involved. What you're describing sounds like it requires enormous mental energy and constant vigilance. In the beginning, yes. But consider the alternative. The man who does not practice inner alchemy expends enormous energy reacting to circumstances, recovering from emotional disruptions, and repeating the same mistakes over and over again. The man who masters these techniques actually conserves energy because he eliminates the waste that comes from unconscious emotional reactions and strategic confusion. Machiavelli stood and moved toward the door, indicating that their session was drawing to a close. Your homework for this week is to apply all three stages of inner alchemy to your current crisis. Reframe the Pazzi conspiracy for maximum power extraction. Mine every aspect of the experience for learning about your own patterns and capabilities. Look for connections between this crisis and previous challenges that might reveal deeper insights about your leadership style and strategic preferences. Lorenzo felt both eager to begin the work and slightly overwhelmed by its scope. Any specific guidance for getting started? Begin with the reframing exercise tonight. Write down every way that this conspiracy might ultimately make you stronger, wiser, or more capable. Force yourself to find at least 20 different potential benefits, even if some seem far-fetched initially. This will train your mind to see opportunities where ordinary perception sees only threats. As Machiavelli prepared to leave, he paused at the door for one final observation. Remember, Lorenzo, the goal is not to become invulnerable to external circumstances. The goal is to become so skilled at extracting power from every experience that no external circumstances can ultimately diminish you. This is the true meaning of what I told you months ago: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Lorenzo spent that evening following Machiavelli's instructions, discovering that the act of searching for hidden benefits in his crisis was itself transformative. By the time he finished writing, the conspiracy that had seemed like pure catastrophe a few hours earlier had revealed itself as an unusually rich opportunity for growth and strategic development. For the first time since the crisis began, Lorenzo fell asleep feeling genuinely grateful for the challenges he faced. Part 3, The Architecture of Unshakable Sovereignty. Winter had settled over Florence when Lorenzo de' Medici received word that his mentor wished to see him at the villa outside the city. 6 months of intensive practice in inner alchemy had transformed not only Lorenzo's approach to leadership but his fundamental relationship to life itself. The young man who had once been paralyzed by anxiety now moved through the world with a kind of calm authority that seemed to radiate from within. Machiavelli was waiting in the villa's library, a fire crackling in the massive stone hearth as snow fell silently beyond the windows. The older man looked up from a manuscript as Lorenzo entered, noting immediately the changed quality of his student's presence. Where once there had been nervous energy and barely contained anxiety, there was now a stillness that seemed to contain tremendous power held in perfect reserve. "Sit, my friend," Machiavelli said, gesturing toward a chair positioned near the fire. "You have come far in these months. The transformation in your bearing, your decision-making, and your effectiveness as a leader has been remarkable to observe. But now we must address the final and most crucial aspect of your development, the architecture of unshakable sovereignty." Lorenzo settled into the chair, curious about what new dimension of inner work his mentor might reveal. "I feel like a different person than I was 6 months ago," he said thoughtfully. "The techniques you've taught me have become so integrated that I barely remember what it was like to live in constant reaction to circumstances. But I sense there are still deeper levels to explore." Machiavelli smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had proven worthy of advanced instruction. "Indeed. Everything we have worked on thus far, detachment, inner alchemy, the systematic extraction of wisdom from experience, these are powerful tools. But they remain tools, external techniques that you apply to your inner landscape. True sovereignty requires something more fundamental, the construction of an inner architecture that is inherently stable, regardless of external circumstances." The phrase captured Lorenzo's attention immediately. "What do you mean by inner architecture?" "Consider the difference between a tent and a castle," Machiavelli replied, settling back in his chair with the air of a master craftsman explaining his most refined techniques. "A tent is portable and useful, but it remains vulnerable to strong winds, storms, and hostile forces. A castle, by contrast, is built upon foundations that cannot be shaken, with walls that cannot be breached, and internal systems that can sustain the inhabitants even under siege." Lorenzo leaned forward, intrigued by the metaphor. "And you're suggesting that consciousness itself can be structured with this kind of inherent stability?" "Precisely. Most men, even those who have developed considerable inner strength, still maintain what I call a tent-like inner structure. Their peace of mind depends on favorable external conditions. Their confidence requires supportive feedback from others. Their sense of purpose relies on achieving specific goals in the world. They have become more skilled at managing these dependencies, but the dependencies themselves remain." Machiavelli rose and moved to a window, his gaze distant as he watched the snow accumulate in the villa's courtyard. "The man who has built true sovereignty has created an inner castle that requires nothing from the external world for its basic functioning. His peace comes from sources that cannot be threatened. His confidence is based on resources that cannot be diminished. His sense of purpose is rooted in principles that cannot be compromised." Lorenzo found the concept both compelling and somewhat mysterious. "How does one actually build this kind of inner structure? It sounds almost mystical." "It is not mystical, though it may seem so to those who have never experienced it. Like physical architecture, inner architecture follows specific principles and requires particular materials. The difference is that we are working with the substance of consciousness itself rather than stone and mortar." Machiavelli returned to his chair and picked up a sheet of paper on which he had drawn a complex diagram. "The foundation of inner sovereignty consists of 3 elements, each of which must be perfectly established before the structure above it can be stable. These are unconditional self-worth, intrinsic purpose, and what I call reality independence. Lorenzo studied the diagram, noting how each element supported and reinforced the others in an integrated system. Can you explain each of these in detail? Certainly. Let us begin with unconditional self-worth, since it forms the bedrock upon which everything else is built. Machiavelli's tone became more formal, like a philosopher presenting a carefully developed thesis. Most men derive their sense of worth from external factors: their achievements, their relationships, their possessions, their reputation, their usefulness to others. This creates a fundamental vulnerability, because all of these factors are subject to change beyond their control. Lorenzo nodded, recognizing patterns in his own previous thinking. I can see how my sense of confidence used to rise and fall based on how well things were going in my external circumstances. Exactly. But unconditional self-worth is derived from something that cannot be threatened or diminished: your essential nature as a conscious being capable of choice, growth, and contribution to the world. This worth is not earned through accomplishment nor lost through failure. It simply is, like your capacity for breathing or thinking. The concept seemed both profound and difficult to grasp practically. Lorenzo struggled to understand how one might actually cultivate this kind of unconditional self-regard. But, how do you develop this foundation when you've spent years basing your self-worth on external factors? Machiavelli smiled, recognizing the challenge his student faced. Through a practice I call worth archaeology, the systematic exploration of the sources from which you currently derive your sense of value, and the gradual transfer of that sense to more fundamental sources. The older man retrieved another notebook from the table beside his chair. You begin by making a completely honest inventory of all the ways your current sense of worth depends on external factors. Write them all down: your position in society, your family's approval, your professional achievements, your physical appearance, your intelligence, your usefulness to others, everything. Lorenzo felt slightly uncomfortable contemplating such a thorough examination of his ego structure. That sounds like it could be quite disturbing to discover how dependent my self-worth really is. It can be, initially. But this discomfort is precisely what indicates the work is necessary. The man who is unconscious of his dependencies cannot address them. The man who sees them clearly has taken the first step toward freedom from them. Machiavelli continued with his explanation of the practice. Once you have identified these dependencies, you begin the process of questioning each one systematically. Ask yourself, if I lost this source of worth, would I cease to be a valuable being? If I had never achieved this particular thing, would my essential nature be different? If others did not recognize this quality in me, would it cease to exist? Lorenzo began to see how such questioning might gradually reveal the arbitrary nature of externally based self-worth. And this questioning actually changes how you feel about yourself? Over time, yes. But the process must be combined with the cultivation of appreciation for your more fundamental qualities: your capacity for awareness, your ability to choose your responses to any situation, your potential for growth and learning, your unique perspective on reality, your power to contribute positively to the world regardless of your current circumstances. The approach seemed methodical yet profound, like a form of philosophical engineering applied to the structure of identity itself. Lorenzo was beginning to understand why Machiavelli had called it architecture rather than simple technique. The second foundation element is intrinsic purpose, Machiavelli continued, referring back to his diagram. Most men derive their sense of purpose from external goals: building wealth, gaining power, earning recognition, achieving specific outcomes in the world. Like externally based worth, this creates vulnerability because external goals can be frustrated or achieved, leaving the person either constantly anxious or ultimately empty. Lorenzo thought about his own relationship to purpose, recognizing how much of his drive had been focused on external achievements. What would intrinsic purpose look like instead? Intrinsic purpose is derived from the opportunity to express your highest qualities through engagement with life, regardless of what specific outcomes that engagement produces. It is purpose that cannot be frustrated because it is fulfilled through the quality of your participation rather than through particular results. Machiavelli stood and moved to a shelf lined with works of philosophy and statecraft. Consider Marcus Aurelius again. His purpose was not to maintain the Roman Empire at a particular size or to achieve specific military victories or to be remembered in a particular way by history. His purpose was to embody wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance in whatever circumstances he encountered. This purpose could be fulfilled whether he was dealing with plague, war, political betrayal, or personal loss. The distinction was illuminating, though Lorenzo still struggled with the practical implications. But, surely external goals matter? Building a prosperous city, protecting one's family, advancing justice in the world, these seem like worthy purposes. They are worthy goals, but they are not the same as purpose. Goals are specific outcomes you work toward. Purpose is the quality of consciousness and character you express while working toward those goals. You can achieve all your goals and still feel empty if you have no intrinsic purpose. You can fail to achieve any particular goal and still feel profoundly fulfilled if your purpose has been expressed fully. Lorenzo felt something shift in his understanding as this distinction became clear. So intrinsic purpose makes you immune to the disappointment of failed goals and the emptiness of achieved goals? Exactly. The man with intrinsic purpose approaches every situation asking not how can I get what I want from this, but how can I bring my highest qualities to this situation? His fulfillment comes from the quality of his engagement rather than from controlling outcomes. Machiavelli returned to his seat and pointed to the third element in his diagram. This brings us to reality independence, perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of inner sovereignty. This means that your inner state, your peace, your clarity, your strength, is not dependent on reality conforming to your preferences. Lorenzo felt a slight chill of recognition, sensing that this concept went even deeper than the previous two. What does that mean in practice? It means you have developed the capacity to be genuinely okay with reality exactly as it is, while simultaneously working skillfully to influence it in positive directions. You are not attached to reality being different from what it is, but you are committed to engaging with it as effectively as possible. The paradox seemed almost impossible to Lorenzo. How can you be okay with injustice, suffering, or harmful situations while also working to change them? Machiavelli's response revealed the sophistication of his thinking on this matter. Because resistance to what is actually reduces your effectiveness at changing it. When you are emotionally disturbed by circumstances, your thinking becomes clouded, your actions become reactive rather than strategic, and your energy becomes dissipated in frustration rather than focused on solutions. The older man illustrated his point with a concrete example. When the plague struck Florence 12 years ago, I observed two types of leaders. The first type was outraged by the unfairness of the disease, frustrated by their inability to control it, and constantly agitated by the suffering around them. Their emotional reaction actually reduced their effectiveness at implementing practical measures to limit the damage. Lorenzo listened intently, recognizing the pattern Machiavelli was describing. The second type of leader accepted the reality of the plague completely, not with resignation or indifference, but with the kind of acceptance that comes from understanding that resistance to what has already happened is a waste of energy. These leaders channeled all their energy into practical responses, organizing medical care, maintaining food distribution, preserving social order, and developing better systems for handling future crises. The distinction became clear to Lorenzo. So reality independence means accepting what is while refusing to accept that it must remain as it is? Perfectly stated. You become independent of needing reality to be different from what it currently is, while maintaining complete commitment to influencing its future development in positive directions. Machiavelli leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming even more serious. These three foundations, unconditional self-worth, intrinsic purpose, and reality independence, create an inner structure that cannot be shaken by external circumstances. The man who has built this architecture possesses what I call unshakable sovereignty because his essential well-being is not dependent on anything outside his control. Lorenzo felt both inspired by the possibility and daunted by the depth of inner work it seemed to require. How long does it typically take to establish these foundations solidly? For a man of intelligence and dedication, the basic structure can be established within 2 to 3 years. But, like physical architecture, inner architecture requires ongoing maintenance and refinement. The truly masterful practitioners spend decades perfecting and strengthening their inner castle. Machiavelli rose and walked to his writing desk, where he retrieved a leather portfolio filled with documents. But even the beginning stages of this work produce extraordinary results. Let me show you some examples of how these principles manifest in practical leadership situations. He opened the portfolio to reveal detailed case studies of historical leaders who had demonstrated various aspects of inner sovereignty. Look at how Elizabeth of England handled the Spanish Armada crisis. Her response demonstrated all three foundations working in perfect coordination. Lorenzo studied the documents with fascination as Machiavelli explained Elizabeth's approach. She displayed unconditional self-worth by remaining calm and confident even when advisors suggested she flee London for safety. Her worth was not dependent on achieving a particular military outcome or on being protected from personal risk. The analysis continued with characteristic precision. She demonstrated intrinsic purpose by focusing on embodying courage and wisdom for her people rather than on controlling the specific details of naval strategy. Her purpose was fulfilled through the quality of her leadership regardless of whether the ships were defeated. Lorenzo was beginning to see the practical power of the principles they had been discussing. And she showed reality independence by fully accepting the enormity of the threat while refusing to waste energy on emotional reactions to circumstances beyond her control. She neither minimized the danger nor became paralyzed by it. Machiavelli closed the portfolio and returned his attention to Lorenzo. The result was that she remained clear-thinking and decisive throughout the crisis, inspiring confidence in others and making optimal strategic decisions under extreme pressure. Her inner sovereignty translated directly into external effectiveness. Lorenzo felt a growing excitement about the possibilities, but also wanted to understand the potential challenges. Are there common obstacles that people encounter when trying to build this kind of inner architecture? Indeed, several predictable challenges arise, Machiavelli replied, returning to his diagram and making additional notes. The first is what I call foundation sabotage, the tendency to unconsciously undermine your own progress because true sovereignty can feel unfamiliar and even threatening to the ego. The concept of self-sabotage in spiritual development was new to Lorenzo, though it resonated with some of his own recent experiences. Why would the ego resist something that would clearly be beneficial? Because the ego's sense of identity is often built around struggle, drama, and dependency. The ego that has always derived its sense of importance from solving external problems may resist a level of inner development that would make such problems less emotionally significant. The ego that has always gotten attention through suffering may unconsciously create new forms of suffering when the old ones are resolved. Machiavelli's analysis revealed a deep understanding of the psychological obstacles to genuine transformation. This is why the work must be approached with both tremendous determination and great patience with yourself. You will find parts of your psyche actively working against your own development, not out of malice but out of attachment to familiar patterns. Lorenzo nodded, recognizing some of these tendencies in his own experience over the past months. What other obstacles should I be prepared for? The second major challenge is sovereignty isolation, the experience of becoming increasingly incomprehensible to people who remain trapped in external dependency. As you develop genuine inner independence, you may find that others interpret your peace as indifference, your clarity as coldness, or your strength as arrogance. This possibility concerned Lorenzo, as he valued his relationships with family, friends, and political allies. How does one maintain meaningful connections while developing this kind of inner sovereignty? Through what I call compassionate sovereignty, the recognition that your inner freedom is not a withdrawal from the world but a gift to it. The more genuinely independent you become from external circumstances, the more available you are to serve others effectively, because your service is no longer contaminated by your own emotional needs. Machiavelli's voice took on a warmer tone as he explained this crucial distinction. The false sovereign withdraws from engagement with others because he mistakes independence for isolation. The true sovereign engages more fully with others because his engagement is no longer desperate or manipulative. Lorenzo found this concept both reassuring and challenging. Can you give me an example of how this works in practice? Certainly. Consider how you now relate to your family members compared to 6 months ago. Previously, your interactions were often colored by your need for approval, your anxiety about their opinions, or your emotional reactions to their moods and behaviors. Now you can be present with them more fully because you are not constantly managing your own internal responses to their actions. The observation was accurate, Lorenzo realized. His relationships had indeed become more genuine and less effortful as he had developed greater inner stability. This pattern extends to all areas of life, Machiavelli continued. The sovereign leader can make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by the need for universal approval. The sovereign friend can offer honest counsel without being devastated if that counsel is rejected. The sovereign lover can give freely without being desperate for reciprocation. Lorenzo was beginning to understand that true sovereignty was not a selfish pursuit but ultimately a form of service to others. So the development of inner independence actually makes one more capable of contributing to the world? Exactly. This is why I chose to share these teachings with you, Lorenzo. Florence needs leaders who can function effectively regardless of external pressures, who can make wise decisions from a place of inner clarity rather than emotional reactivity, and who can inspire confidence in others through their own unshakable stability. Machiavelli moved to the window again, where the snow had stopped falling and the first stars were becoming visible in the clear winter sky. There is one final aspect of sovereignty we must discuss before you are ready to begin the advanced practices: the relationship between personal power and service to something greater than yourself. Lorenzo sensed that they were approaching the culmination of his instruction. I'm ready to understand this final piece. True sovereignty is never an end in itself. It is always a means to more effective service of worthy causes. The man who builds inner independence solely for his own benefit will find that his sovereignty becomes hollow and ultimately self-defeating. But the man who develops sovereignty in order to serve justice, beauty, truth, or the welfare of others will find that his power continues to grow throughout his life. The statement struck Lorenzo as profoundly important, though he wasn't immediately sure why. Can you explain the connection between sovereignty and service? Power that is not directed toward worthy ends becomes corrupted and eventually turns against itself. But power that is dedicated to serving something greater than personal gratification becomes purified and strengthened through its expression. This is why the greatest sovereigns in history were also the greatest servants of noble causes. Machiavelli returned to his seat and opened a final section of his notebook. This is the ultimate architecture of sovereignty, an inner foundation that cannot be shaken, supporting a structure of personal power that is entirely dedicated to service of the highest good you can perceive. Such a man becomes truly invincible because he has aligned his personal development with forces greater than himself. Lorenzo felt the profound truth of what his mentor was saying, though the practical implications seemed almost overwhelming in scope. How does one identify and commit to this kind of higher service? Through a process of deep listening to your own authentic nature, combined with clear observation of the genuine needs of the world around you. Where your deepest gifts meet the world's greatest needs, there you will find your unique form of service. Machiavelli closed his notebook and looked directly at Lorenzo with an expression of complete seriousness. You have now received instruction in the complete architecture of unshakable sovereignty. You understand the foundations, the methods of construction, and the ultimate purpose of the structure. What remains is years of patient, disciplined practice to transform these concepts into lived reality. Lorenzo felt both honored and sobered by the magnitude of what had been shared with him. What specific practices should I focus on to begin building these foundations? Begin with one foundation at a time, spending at least 6 months on each before moving to the next. Start with unconditional self-worth, using the worth archaeology practice I described earlier. Document your progress carefully, noting both advances and resistances. Meet with me monthly to discuss your observations and receive refinements to your practice. Machiavelli stood, indicating that their session was drawing to a close. Remember, Lorenzo, the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has eliminated every source of external vulnerability. But the man who builds true sovereignty serves not only his own invincibility but the elevation of all those whose lives he touches. As Lorenzo prepared to leave the villa that evening, he carried with him not just intellectual understanding but a profound sense of possibility. The architecture of sovereignty was no longer a theoretical concept but a practical blueprint for the most important construction project of his life. The snow had resumed falling as he rode back toward Florence, each flake catching the light of the moon like tiny stars descending from heaven. Lorenzo found himself thinking that this natural beauty was perhaps a reflection of the same perfection he was learning to build within his own consciousness, a structure as enduring as the mountains and as luminous as the winter sky. 6 months later, when Florence faced its greatest political crisis in a generation, Lorenzo's response demonstrated the practical fruits of his inner work. He moved through the chaos with a calm that inspired confidence in his allies and commanded respect from his enemies. His decisions were clear and strategic rather than reactive. His presence seemed to generate stability in situations that had previously created only confusion and fear. Those who observed him during this period often remarked that he seemed like a different man entirely from the anxious young heir they had known just 2 years earlier. They were correct in their observation, though few understood the systematic inner work that had produced such transformation. Lorenzo de' Medici had indeed become a different man, one who had discovered that true power lay not in controlling external circumstances but in building an inner architecture so solid that no external force could disturb its essential stability. He had learned to destroy his weak self not through violence or suppression but through the patient construction of something far stronger in its place. And, in becoming truly sovereign within himself, he had gained the capacity to serve his city, his people, and his principles with an effectiveness that would have been impossible when he was still enslaved to his own emotional reactions and external dependencies. The architecture of unshakable sovereignty was no longer a theory but a living reality, as solid and permanent as the foundations of the greatest palaces ever built by human hands, yet infinitely more valuable because it could never be destroyed by time, force, or circumstance. In mastering the hidden source of emotional power, Lorenzo had discovered something that would serve him, and, through him, serve others, for the remainder of his days.